What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Hope you're all doing well. I took a few days off of doing some videos, which was nice. It was nice to reset the brain, but I just got back from an early screening for a movie, so you know what time it is. So without further ado, let's get into my thoughts on the newest film based on a Stephen King novel, and that film is called The Long Walk. Directed by Francis Lawrence, this film stars people like Cooper Hoffman, David Jonsson, Mark Hamill, and more. So when I first saw the trailer for this film, I was pretty intrigued. It looked like it was something that was going to be pretty gripping and unique and different. In this world, we have a lot of sequels, we have a lot of things that are based on already existing properties, but one thing you can always trust when it comes down to some originality is a book or a story that's written by Stephen King. And there's so many incredible stories from this man that I've never heard of. This film is based on a book that he wrote back in 1979 of the same name, and so I was pretty excited to check it out because, again, the trailer just seemed interesting. And my excitement only rose more so when I found out that it was directed by Francis Lawrence, who has done every film in the Hunger Games franchise since Catching Fire, and has also directed things like I Am Legend and Constantine, the DC Studios film, back in the day, not DC Studios, but the DC Comics movie based on the character of Constantine that stars Keanu Reeves. So once I saw that and the fact that you got Mark Hamill in here as the villain of the film, I was pretty excited to check it out. So without further ado, let's get into what this film is all about, and then we'll get into my thoughts on the film. Set in the dystopian United States under authoritarian control, 50 teenage boys are forced into an annual walking contest. Participants must maintain a minimum speed of 3 miles per hour or face execution after 3 warnings. The contest continues until only one walker remains alive, earning wealth and the fulfillment of any one wish. And I'm happy to start off this review by saying I really enjoyed this film. I found it to be a very well acted film that's very well made, and a film that also utilizes some pretty straightforward, simplistic filmmaking that gave it, I think, an edge in this world. In a world where we have a lot of really bloated films. We just got out of the summer box office season, and there were some great films, some big spectacle films that I think we can all say were a lot of fun to watch, but there's a lot of big CG heavy films all the time, and there's all these huge studio films that come out that are just going for big all the time and have to use a lot of special effects and different things like that. And in the case of The Long Walk, this is a film that may not work for everybody because its pace isn't going for bombastic. It's not going for overly exciting all the time. But it's a film that focuses on characters. It's a film that takes its time developing what's going on. But it's also a film that, again, isn't really about shocking events all the time, despite the fact that it certainly has its fair share of shocking events. Now, what I'll start this off by saying is that when it comes down to filmmaking, this is a really strong piece of filmmaking that utilizes simplistic filmmaking. Again, going back to the point I was just making about the big bloated films, it's okay to have those, but it's nice to see a film like this that really honestly has solid cinematography, but mainly is really employing great performances of a bunch of guys walking on a road. That is majority of this film, and outside of that, and of course solid editing and musical score and all the things you need in terms of the behind the scenes of post-production work, when it comes down to what we're seeing on screen, there's not a whole lot of visual effects. There's not a whole lot of different things that are making this film more than actors acting on screen, walking on a road. And when it comes down to props, majority of it is just, some costumes, which is just regular clothes, and specifically military props, as you have a group of military individuals, a military convoy, who are following behind our characters here. And while there is some use of practical effects in terms of blood and gore in the film, and a mix of VFX that are also used for those gore effects throughout the course of the film, this is a film that most of the time feels just like a, just straightforward movie. Everything is mostly caught in camera. It's a simplistic concept, but they utilize that concept to tell you a pretty interesting story here. And again, all of it is really elevated by great performances, with the absolute standouts of the film being the 2 main leads in the film, which are played by Cooper Hoffman, who plays the character of Ray, and then you have David Jonsson, who's the character of Peter. You have 2 characters who meet pretty early on in the film, and they make a bond amidst this big group of guys that are walking. And over the course of time, you get to meet a slew of different characters. Some are just background characters, some have a couple of lines of dialogue here and there and aren't really all that much. A couple are there just to be fodder and end up getting, taken out pretty early on into the film or at certain points in the film. And there's also several other characters that you'll find yourself connected to as the movie plays out, who unfortunately meet their demise because there can only be one winner at the end of this film. And so the film does a good job of having a good set of characters throughout the course of it. For the most part, too, a lot of actors I wasn't really familiar with, including the main guy, the character of Ray, played by Cooper Hoffman. I thought he was really solid in this film. He plays like a really realistic character. He feels like a real guy, and I really enjoyed his performance throughout the course of the film. And he's the heart in a lot of ways, a character who has a good heart, that has a good mind, that has a good head on his shoulders, and wants to help people throughout this journey, a journey that only one person can win. And I liked that there was a group of characters that wanted to help each other for a period of time. But of course, like any other situation like this, you have the a-hole characters in the mix. You have the characters who are just weak right out of the gate, maybe some that you will underestimate, maybe some that you overestimate, who think that they're way better than they actually are going to be. You have some cocky characters, you have a mix of characters who are just focused and don't really say a whole lot. So I think the film does a really good job of balancing different dynamics, especially in the first, 30, 50 minutes or so of the film. They do a good job of having a lot of different things going on and different character dynamics that kept things engaging and exciting to watch, and allowed in those smaller moments for some of these characters to get to know each other through small moments of dialogue or humor that allowed us to kind of get these human moments from these characters, which is where the film really tackles a variety of themes. This is a film that has a lot to say, because while it is at the center a film about a bunch of young guys that are taking this long walk with this prize at the very end of it, it is a film that ultimately has a lot to say about society. Now, I'm going to get into some gripes that I have about the society we see in this film in just a second, but in terms of the themes that this film explores, this film has a lot to say when it comes down to survival and endurance, of course, right? The notion of what are you willing to do? What are you willing to push through? What are you willing to kind of give of yourself? Where's that grit coming from in order to push? You also have the idea of youth and the exploitation of that. The notion that, a lot of times young people get thrown into the world and there's this expectation immediately on them that they have to be able to kind of push themselves to as far as they possibly can to kind of like earn respect. And I think that there's something to that as well. And then of course you have the authoritarian part of the film. You got Mark Hamill in the film kind of chewing up the scenery as this big major in the military that's part of this authoritarian group. I love Mark Hamill. It's great to see Luke Skywalker go bad again. Of course he's played the Joker, so you can kind of hear that he was kind of bringing a little bit of that here. Definitely wasn't going full Joker by any stretch of the imagination, but you can tell that he was bringing that grit and a little bit of that gravitas from that character, and you can tell he was definitely chewing it up playing this character who in a lot of ways doesn't have a lot of nuance, right? He's playing a character that is simply meant to be just a blank slate of just authoritarianism. And I think in terms of this film, he portrays, and in general, the entirety of the military convoy, it portrays this notion of obedience, right? And falling in line, and what happens when you fall out of that line, and how it's more so depicted as weakness and less so because you're maybe trying to fight against the system. And I thought that was an interesting theme that the film tackled as well. Outside of that, you also have things like when it comes down to identity, morality, humanity, and when are those things lost? The idea of death as well, and the acceptance of that death. I think that's a big part of this film as well. You have characters who are driven for a period of the film to ultimately come to terms with the fact that they are going to die, that this isn't going to go much further for them. And it's about how they all choose to tackle that notion. And do they choose to go out with humility, or do they choose to go out as cowards, or do they choose to go out with peace, or do they choose to go out with fear? And I think that this film kind of tackles all of those different subjects in a lot of interesting ways, while you just have a movie at the center of it that's in a lot of ways very similar to Hunger Games, which I think is interesting that you have Francis Lawrence directing this film, because there is an element, because not only is it a bunch of kids that are going, or a bunch of young guys going into this, big long walk, but they're all from one state, which is very similar to the kind of the districts, and the world is kind of in shambles. There's a dystopian US that we're seeing here in this film. And that was one element I wish we would have seen a little bit more of. I won't lie. There was an element that made me want to know, what is the state of the world outside of just being told that it's not really great, that there's a lot of poverty, and that the economic stance of the United States is not necessarily in the same place it used to be. And they kind of allude to the fact that this is kind of helping re-strengthen the economy. But again, I wish that we would have dived a little bit deeper into that. They leave it with some ambiguity, which I can appreciate, but I do think that it would have added a little bit more to the film if we were able to kind of get a little bit more of the idea of the state of the world. Even though this isn't really what the film is about, it is something that I would have liked to have seen. And lastly, in terms of themes and stuff like that, I think it does a good job of also tackling things like friendship and camaraderie and just handling all of that really, really well. And also the notion of spectacle, right? And the entertaining side of spectacle, right? Because this entire long walk is being televised to the world, and there are people, spectators, who see them along the walk who are watching these moments, including kids who are watching people get gunned down in the middle of the street. And so there is this spectacle nature to it. And so I do think that this film has a lot to say about the long walk of life and how a lot of times we're put in front of other people and people are there to help you. Sometimes they won't help you. Sometimes people will do something to make you fall and make you kind of fall behind and eventually be executed or, have a bad, thing happen in your life. And a lot of people can just be watching it and not really doing much about it, not helping, not really even be sad about it, just viewing it as a piece of how life goes. And so I think that this film has a lot to say about the way that culture can kind of be complicit to things and just the notion of going on the long walk of life and how, even when you want to help somebody, sometimes life is kind of built in a manner where even helping somebody will maybe hold you back or get you hurt, or sometimes it isn't even worth it. Whether you want to or not, sometimes the system is built in a way where it's not even worth it. And it's interesting that this was a film that's based on a book from 1979, because you look at the state of the world today, and I think that there's some interesting parallels, and I think that that's part of what strengthens this film in a lot of ways. Now, for the most part, as you can tell, I thought this was a pretty solid film. But I will say, I think this is a film that's going to live or die when it comes down to the ending for a lot of people. When it comes to me, I like the way that the film ended, but there is a sense of ambiguity to an extent. It kind of just fades to black at a certain point, and you wonder, okay, well, what's next? What's next for the characters that we're seeing here? What's next for the character in particular that we're seeing here? And what I'll say here is that there was a bit of a predictability to me. When I looked at all the characters that we were focusing on, where the film was going, I kind of guessed the film was going to end to some degree how it did. There is some surprise still, though, and there's a couple of elements that I think, for the most part, are handled really well. But when it comes down to how this film kind of plays out in its latter half, I do think there was times where it felt like it was dragging a little bit. I think there are moments where it feels like it overstayed its welcome or was a little extra slow. And I do think that the film has a lot of interesting characters, with some of them being offed, with them never really showing them being offed ever. So it just kind of feels like you have some characters that just eventually randomly disappear, which I guess is maybe to make it feel like you're in the mind of the characters. But then it also makes you wonder, well, why did we even spend time with those characters at any point in the film? And then later on in the film, you also have characters who maybe you saw in the background throughout the film, but hadn't really had a lot of lines of dialogue or any sort of real camera focus, who eventually have a little bit of camera focus in the latter part of the film, only for them to be offed shortly after. And then again, it begs the question of why? Of course, in a film like this where you have 50 characters going on this walk, there's gonna be people who start to fall off that are just kind of there to be fodder for the story and really setting up the stakes. But it's one of those things where at times it made me wish that some of the characters had been expanded upon a little bit more, or that some of the characters that they did choose to spend time with had a little bit more to do. There was a couple of characters in particular, one character who's kind of viewed as like a big threat in the earlier part of the movie, who has a big reveal near the end, who I thought was an interesting character, but I don't know that the film does enough to really make him overly compelling, other than this big reveal he has at the end. So I do think there was moments where this film could have maybe handled some of the characters a little bit better. There were some characters I wish we got a little bit more of that are there and feel like they're a part of the story, but I feel like I should have felt sadder when they were killed, and maybe I just didn't. And I just at times felt like there was something missing. At times it felt like there were scenes that were missing. And I think that's also partially because you have scenes where you go from, the 50-mile mark, and suddenly it, jumps to the next scene, and it's like, they've walked another 30, 40 miles, and the characters are suddenly closer to one another, or maybe they're a little bit more tired, so they're being kind of frustrated with one another. And sometimes it felt like, because we were jumping between these different times, hours apart from one another, it didn't always feel like a story that was also 100% cohesive when it comes down to all the side characters. Though when it comes down to our main two characters, again played by Cooper Hoffman and David Jonsson, I thought that the two of them were pretty fantastic, and those were the moments that really, really shined the most. So at its core, I think that The Long Walk is a really solid flick. It's an ending that I don't know everybody's gonna love, because it begs the question of, was that the most satisfying ending? I can see what they were going for, but does that kind of undercut certain elements? I think it's going to be one of those things that really depends on you. But when it comes down to performance, when it comes down to filmmaking, when it comes down to how this film was put together, and just being an entertaining time at the movies, I think this is one of those films that can make you think. It's one of those films that can get you engaged, and it's a simplistic concept that feels original and unique. And in a world with big bloated budget films, it's nice to see something that's a little bit more contained and isn't going for big and bombastic. So that's going to be my thoughts on The Long Walk. Leave some comments down below. Are you planning on checking out this film? Have you already checked out this film? Whatever the case may be, leave any and all comments down below, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye-bye.